And we are going to continue with Nehemiah. We're in Nehemiah chapter 6. We kind of got down to verse 15 last week, if you remember, because the wall is done. The wall has been completed. Like I said, it took 52 days to complete this wall. Again, as we read before, you got not only the walls that are the protection, but then you also have the gates that we talked about. I think there was a list of about 13 gates within this city. Some was within inside like the inner wall and so on around the temple. But anyway, so the mission that Nehemiah was sent on, that he asked the king of Persia to go to Jerusalem, it is done. So from this point on, we're going to look at what's next, or now what. You know, we've kind of done what we've set out to do. So how do we, I guess, continue this momentum? If you look at leadership and Nehemiah's leadership, that's kind of where we are having to look at within the next few chapters in Nehemiah. So what is next? I do want to start with the end of chapter 6, because when you are trying to complete a task, and we talked about getting buy-in. He focused on what God wanted him to do, so God was kind of his center. And we've been a part of things like that. We have this initiative. We have the buy-in. We've got everything going. But then all of a sudden, and we've talked about how that the enemies around Jerusalem was trying to trick Nehemiah. They were trying to halt this process. They didn't want it to be completed. And now we have something that is so troublesome, not only to us if we're trying to start that initiative, and that is trouble from within. Now, we talked a little bit briefly about how they were complaining, and Nehemiah could be losing his workforce. We talked about that last week. But we've also talked about the enemies that are kind of spearheading, trying to offer this resistance. And I want to look at chapter 6, beginning with verse 17. Again, the wall's done, the mission is done, but unfortunately there's still issues that Nehemiah has to have. Because just like with us today, whenever we have an initiative and we get it completed, that's still a vulnerable time. And you may have been in businesses or the work that you're in where maybe a supervisor, or it may have come down from corporate, or maybe if you own your own business, you're kind of make this big investment and you've got what you want, but it's still a very vulnerable time, because it's kind of hit or miss sometimes when you're starting out or when you finally get that done. And here's kind of what happens in chapter 6, beginning of verse 17. Also in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came to them. Now, if you remember, Tobiah is one of those mentioned enemies that's been a thorn in Nehemiah's side since he got back. But yet, the nobles of Judah are the one that's sending these letters to him. And it goes on, for many in Judah were pledged to him, because he was the son-in-law, and forgive me again of these pronunciations, of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son, Jehohanan, had married the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berchiah, and they reported his good deeds before me, and reported my words to him. Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. So, how do we deal with trouble from within? Prayer, okay. Because Nehemiah has completed this wall, but now the nobles of Judah are corresponding with this gentleman that's been almost basically an enemy to Nehemiah all this time. So how do you handle that situation with troubles from within? Have to confront them some way or another. It could definitely keep festering. You know, they could have people turn on you very quickly. So, and you don't have to answer this out loud, but are there enemies, and I hate to use that word, but are there enemies within the church that we have to be very mindful of? Because again, Nehemiah's completed his mission, the wall is done, but yet there's these grumblings that, again, this very volatile time, you've got Tobiah that could really cause issues, that could almost, in essence, kind of destroy what all that they've done. So yeah.
Even though the devil is not in the church in terms of saved, he's always present.
That's very true.
He's behind much of the turmoil that goes on.
Yeah, very much so.
It just will cause it to continue.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. I was listening to someone talk about, as I was studying Isaiah, he mentioned something very similar in that, you know, the devil's always there, and you may not see it, but when you start waving that Christian flag, that's when he's probably going to really make his presence known to you, to really try to stop that progress. Yes, Jim? Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, the Old Testament is kind of it's kind of full of God's leaders that are being contested by in some cases you take like Moses. I mean, kind of the inner group. They're constantly trying to rebel or complaining or so on. But Nehemiah also has some very loyal friends, some I don't know if you want to use the word confidants, but those people that he can trust, and that's where we get into chapter 7. Chapter 7 is going to introduce us to a gentleman in verse 2 of chapter 7, and his name is Hananiah. Now, does that name sound familiar to any of you? Yeah, I thought it was Hananiah at first. It kind of threw me when I looked at it again. We have actually read this name once before in our study of Nehemiah. If you go back to chapter 1 and verse 2, this is the gentleman that gave the report to Nehemiah. This is the gentleman that it appears as either he had correspondence with that first group that went back, that was with Ezra and Zerubbabel, or he had made that journey and had come back, and Nehemiah asks him in chapter 1 here, how's Jerusalem? And you know, it's kind of funny, I think sometimes we ask that question with a lot of enthusiasm. You know, we see old friends and, you know, maybe some people from your high school that you hadn't seen in a long, long time, or maybe a former church that you attended before you moved here. And you ask them with that excitement of, you know, how are things going? And all of a sudden they give you this terrible news. You know, maybe a spouse had died, or maybe a child had died, or maybe, you know, someone is battling cancer. And, you know, it's almost like you don't necessarily... You kind of realize that, yeah, bad things are going to happen, and that may be something they tell you, but, you know, when it's almost like when he saw Hananiah, you know, how is it back home? You know, how is it in Jerusalem? And he's just like, it's, you know, the walls are down, we have no protection, and it's kind of about bad news. And so Nehemiah starts his journey, or after months of prayer, he asks to go back and to help build this wall. I want to notice in verse 2 this description, that I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hananiah, and Hananiah the leader of the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. I want you to think about that phrase for a moment. And do any of you have people in your life that you could describe that way? Man or woman? A faithful person, man or woman, and feared God more than many. Think about that for a minute. Do you have someone that you could describe that way?
We all do if you really think back.
True.
There's somebody that's affected every one of us in this room.
Mm-hmm.
May not be spectacular,
Right.
but somebody, I suspicion, affected every one of us in some little way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you're right. Jim, you were going to say something? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Very, very, very good point. Yeah. Yeah, I think, when you think about how, what it was that impacted you or influenced you to respond to that call of dedicating your life to Christ, more than likely there was some man or woman that influenced you, or you kind of had that image of this is what it's like to follow God. And again, in the Old Testament, this idea of fear God, it's not like us being afraid of the dark, or we have these phobias. It's a matter of respecting God and doing God's will and so on. It's not that I'm afraid He's going to throw lightning bolts down and kill me type of deal. We'll hear that phrase a lot when we study Isaiah as well. But again, it's one of those descriptive terms that we don't see a lot in the Bible, but it's one that I think is very important in looking at. Nehemiah has all these enemies around us, but yet there are people that he can trust and that he can delegate authority to and be okay. So again, think about that for a minute. Chapter 7, if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of verses, but yet basically what chapter 7, verses 7 through 62 is basically a list of people that came back. If you want to know who all came back from exile, well, there's a list of them in chapter 7 of Nehemiah, okay? Now, again, with first grade phonics not working for me, I'm not going to deal with verses 7 through 62, okay? But if you want a list of it, there's there. Now, some of the descriptive things of these lists are interesting to me. For instance, in verse 44, you have the singers that came back. In verse 45, you have the gatekeepers that came back. So again, there are some descriptive terms of people as you go through this list. But again, it's a list of people that I'm going to kind of skip over if you don't mind. In verses 63 and 64, you're going to have a description of the priests that came back, and that is going to be an important point later on, because again, if you are going to like consecrate and dedicate, there's things that priests are the ones that do this, and so it is very important that you have those priests that come back. And then in verse 66, you begin a description of all the animals that came back as well. There's 42,360 people. There's servants, there's singing men and singing women. There's horses, there's mules, there's camels, and there's donkeys. All right, so that's basically what chapter 7 deals with. Okay, is all these people and all these things that came back. And again, this is several hundreds of miles of journey that they did. I may have mentioned this last week. When a conquering nation usually dispelled people. They would take them out of their region and move them somewhere else in order to better control them and, make sure that they are in charge. I mean, if you're in a foreign place and you're having to basically start all over again, then you're more concerned about surviving than you are rebelling against the king that conquered your land. And so the idea and the notion of a conquering nation allowing people to go back home was kind of weird. And so when the king of Persia did that, Persia conquered the Babylons, and then he said, okay, all y'all that Babylon moved and displaced, y'all can go back home. And that was very unusual. And I think I may have mentioned that before. So we have this remnant, and that'll be a term we'll see a lot in the book of Isaiah, this remnant that has come back. And here's in chapter 7, you have a list of who those people are. I've looked at it through some commentaries, those that can look at names and where they are in history, and I just didn't see any that kind of stood out as far as, like I said, you have the priests and so on, some of the titles, but as far as any of these people that's listed, I don't know of them impacting Jewish history. And at least is what I've looked at and what I've looked at through commentaries and so on, okay? Another thing is that, remember, Nehemiah is kind of the last of the Jewish history biblically before you jump into Matthew. So unless there's some mention in some of the minor prophets, we don't have a lot of information past Nehemiah biblically as to what happens with the Jewish people.
Verse 64 hit me when I read it. It, I think, highlights what we've seen throughout the Old Testament and we'll see in the New Testament. They couldn't prove that their ancestral registry wasn't right.
Yep.
So they were excluded. They were outcast.
Yep.
How important that tracing yourself back to Abraham chronologically.
Right.
Otherwise, you weren't one of them.
That is correct, yeah. Yeah, in verse he was talking about in verse 64, of chapter 7, it says, those who were registered by genealogy, but it was not found, they could not trace their lineage back. And it says, therefore they were excluded from the priesthood as defiled, meaning that you weren't pure enough, and so you could not trace yourself back.
Part of that was as many as 100 years. So we're talking about my great-grandpa, and so they lost those records.
Yeah.
They weren't in a synagogue.
Right.
They were miles away from the country. They didn't care what you're at. Nobody kept records.
Yeah. So it is one, and many classes I've been in when it talks about the destruction of Jerusalem at AD 70, that was another thing that, all of that ability to trace back was destroyed. So yeah, you had to kind of exclude that. So we are looking, and I was reading, and this was something that I noticed in Ezra, and I don't know if now's the best time to go back to that or not, but in Ezra chapter 3, remember one of Ezra's main things when they went back was to rebuild the temple and the wall, but the wall was not completed, and that's what was reported back to Nehemiah. But in Ezra chapter 3, is it verse 12? Oh yeah. In Ezra chapter 3, they had restored this, that the restoration of the temple had begun. But it says, but many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes, yet many shouted aloud for joy. So it's one of those where you do have anywhere from 70 to 80 years that they are in exile, but there was still people that was kind of, the poorest of the poor were left in Jerusalem. You have Daniel and all the nobles and all the fine, healthy people, they were taken, but you still got this group. And so as I read Nehemiah, it's kind of interesting to think that there are people that I guess they were so young when it was destroyed that you're still going to have people that remember what it was like. And that's an interesting piece of Jewish history here, is that people actually remembered the first temple and its grandeur with Solomon when it was rebuilt by Ezra and them. Speaking of Ezra, let's skip to chapter 8, and we're going to go through about verse 12 of chapter 8 here. I'm not going to read it, but this will be kind of where we focus on. In Nehemiah chapter 1, we speak of Ezra. So in Nehemiah chapter 8, in verse 1, we see this. Now all the people gathered together as one man in the open square that was in front of the water gate. Again, another gate mentioned. And they took Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded Israel. All right, so Ezra is, it says the scribe here. So again, politically speaking, Nehemiah is governor of this area. But Ezra is looked at as like a religious leader, or at least a scribe, as it's told in this case. And so it's verse 2. So Ezra the priest, I think this is the same person, brought the law before the assembly of men and women and all who could hear with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. Then he read from it in the open square that was in the front of the water gate from morning until midday before the men and women of those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Let me keep reading for just a moment. So Ezra the scribe stood on the platform of wood which they had made for the purpose, and beside him at his right hand, I'm not going to mention all those names. Verse 5, and Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above all the people, and when he opened it, all the people stood up, and Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God. Then all the people answered, Amen, Amen, while lifting up their hands. And they bowed their heads and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. Now, what does it mean here? He kept saying, those who could hear with understanding. What does he mean by that? He kind of says that twice here. Yeah, I think so. That's one thing. Yeah, absolutely. It's literally just they didn't understand it. it's kind of like, you read something and you just, okay, like if somebody read me a math thing, I'd be like, no, wait a minute, you're going to slow down for a minute. What? So yeah, I think it was just almost like a lack of knowledge as well. Any other thoughts on lack of understanding?
Well, they've been gone 70 years, and all the intermarriages, interactions with everybody who didn't have the same language,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We have our own dialect in Tennessee.
Right, you are correct.
My neighbors across the street are from New Jersey.
Gotcha. So they don't say y'all? Because I said y'all a while ago and I caught myself.
She looks at me like, what?
Yeah, gotcha. That is another good point here with understanding. Some commentators say, again, not only is the lack of knowledge, like they just don't, it's like they can't comprehend what's being said. Some are saying that this may have been written in Chaldean, and they were having to this was written in Hebrew, and they had basically been grown up with the Chaldean dialect in captivity, and so they were actually having to almost translate this as they were going. So again, I'd never really heard that before until I was studying this, a couple of months ago. That again, the people that was raised in captivity, I mean, the only Hebrew language they heard was probably with their parents, if they were there.
Could it be that they didn't have a copy of the word and they hadn't heard and all that?
I think that's true too, yeah. I think it's true. Probably what they knew was only by oral history, like what was told to them. So, no, not at all. I couldn't even read it in Hebrew. I can barely even pronounce. I mean, I have trouble with phonics anyway with the English translation of the Hebrew word. For those that and there's here that know Greek and some that know Hebrew. I mean, it's hard for me to even pronounce those type of names. There's a phrase, and I don't have it written down what verse it's in. One of these verses, we use the phrase, it gave the sense, S-E-N-S-E, and that's where we talk about understanding. What is verse 8? Oh, yes, verse 8. So they read distinctly from the book and the law of God, and they gave the sense and helped them to understand the reading. So again, there was this idea they had trouble understanding what was going on or what was being said. Gave the sense. So if that is the case, so why is it important to study the Word of God? All right, so you'll know what we need to do.
I think you're less likely to forget things.
Mm-hmm.
Go over it.
Sure, yeah.
On a routine basis, you remember things.
Right, yeah, very much.
The things as in the New Testament show itself through the work of me.
Mm-hmm.
Rightly dividing, understanding.
Right, the Word of truth, yeah.
You need to study to understand what the Bible says, what God's Word is.
Yeah.
It doesn't come just by accident, it comes by hard work.
Yeah. Yeah, very much. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, definitely short-term memory, you can cram it in there for 24 hours maybe, but is it going to stay with you? Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Used to be a show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People found out, regardless of how brilliant they were today and accomplished, they can't remember all that stuff. They failed things in the fifth grade.
Yeah.
That they knew.
Yep.
They don't know anymore.
Yeah, that's right. someone, I don't know if this was a study or someone said, but usually if you don't use something within 7 years or maybe 10 years, then you basically have lost it. You have forgotten it. So all that Pythagorean theorem that y'all made A's on in high school, it's pretty much gone. Sadly, that's the only theorem that I can remember right off, is that one. Can't spell it, but I can pronounce it and at least know what it is. So again, it's kind of sad to think about when you think about what all God did for the children of Israel. I mean, you go from bringing Abraham out, and then you have all that issue with Isaac. Then you have Jacob, and then you have slavery in Egypt. Then you have the deliverance, and then you have the Red Sea and the Ten Commandments, but then you have the wandering in the wilderness, and then you finally have Canaan, and then you have the judges and all the turmoil that was happening in during that time. Then they want a king, which is kind of what God really, I'm your king, but all right, and here's what's going to happen. Then Saul does what he does, and then you finally have David, the man after God's own heart, and then you have his grandson that causes a division among the kingdoms, and then basically you have this the Judah, which only has Judah and Benjamin that are kind of staying loyal to the line of David, and God's finally like, I'm done, and they're exiled, and they're brought back, but it's almost like you're having to start all over again with the law. I mean, the law that was given to Moses. And what's sad is you got this group of people that there's several of them that they don't understand. They're not able to grasp and understand this law. Whether it be they just can't comprehend it, I'm going to use the term intellectually, or they just can't understand it because of the language barrier, because they've been in exile all these years. So it's kind of a sad situation, I feel, that you've got this group starting all over again. But why does this group have to start all over again? Why does the remnant have to start all over? Why is that important?
I think you have people that are coming back. They don't know what to expect. You have people that were left behind. They continue God's law. Did somebody read? Did somebody pretend they were the priest and all? They were all gone.
Yeah, they were gone. Yeah.
All the leadership, everything's gone.
Yeah.
So then all they show up. Well, it wasn't me, but it was my great-grandpa.
Yeah.
He was running the show.
Yeah.
Well, who are you?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
There's going to be some confrontation and re-education. Who's in charge now?
Right.
People that have been there for 70 years? Well, all of y'all were gone. We still kept
exactly. That's right.
No, it wasn't your fault,
but
back like you're going to take over.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We've all had that kind of...
House.
That's exactly. We've probably all experienced something like that before, yeah. Without this remnant, and without them going back to the law of God, you got to remember, this is the group that will be in existence 400 years later when Jesus will be born in the manger. And so, when you think of God's plan of saving the world, even though he was so fed up with his family, and he said, you're going to be taken over, you're taken over by Assyria, Babylon's going to come in, but there's going to be a remnant. And that remnant in Nehemiah has come back, And they're kind of starting over with the law of Moses. But again, that will carry on for the next 400 years. And that'll be the situation that we'll be in when we read the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it is very important that this kept going. I mean, of course, God's in control. So, I mean, it wasn't like they were going to be conquered by, the neighboring countries. But that's why it's so important for this to continue on. It talks about in verses 9 through 12 here about how some people were grieved when they heard the law. Verse 9 here very quickly. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn nor weep." For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. Then he said to them, "Go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet, and send portions to those for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy to our Lord. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." So the Levites quieted all the people, saying, "Be still, for the day is holy. Do not be grieved." And all the people went their way to eat and drink, to send their portions, and rejoiced greatly because they understood the words that were declared to them. Why were they sad at first? Why were they sad? Right? Yeah. 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 Yeah, probably so. I sometimes think, in the New Testament, when you have, we have the letters of Paul and the letters to the church at Ephesus, the letter, Peter, or, the church at Galatia, Galatia was the region, my bad. But you have like Peter writing his letters. How excited was a city when word got around that a letter from Paul had come or a letter from Peter had come? And, it just kind of, everybody starts telling, "Hey, we've got a letter from Peter," or "We've got a letter from Peter," or "The ship came in and Paul's written a letter to us." And how excited was the church during that first century when that got spread around the city, and they knew that when they came together on that next first day of the week that they were going to get to hear a letter from Paul or a letter from Peter, and it could have been others, that we don't have in the Bible, but maybe Timothy may have written a letter, and so word got out, "Hey, Timothy's written us a letter," or Titus, or some of those other names mentioned in the New Testament. How excited people would get when that news spread. And so you've got this group of people that, after all this time, may have never, and depending on the time and the age of people, they may have been the second generation that may have been able to hear this for the first time. I mean, if they were born in captivity, their parent may have died in captivity, and they may have never been able to hear, or maybe their parents never was able to hear it directly spoken. And so now, for the first time in decades, you have a priest of God standing before a huge crowd of people reading a law that's hundreds of years old, that guided not just their parents and their grandparents or their great-grandparents, but many grandparents before. And just how overwhelming that was for them. And so Nehemiah and them have to say, "Listen, don't cry. Be happy. Be happy that you're in this position now, that you have this, that you are able to hear these words and to understand what God wants you to do." and be happy about that. And as was said, we have almost every one of us has a Bible that we can take home with us and to use and to open it whenever we feel the desire to, and just how lucky we are that we can do that. I remember watching a video about, I do not remember the missionary of who she was, but she learned this language of this tribe, and and it was translated into their language. And you know, where we have like Holy Bible or something on the outside, there was something that didn't translate very, very well or whatever. I'm not sure the whole story. I just remember this one part. But at the opening of the book that was translated, it was called God's Carvings. Was what the book was, and I thought just how wonderful a title that was to what was inside of that book was the words of God. And so, anyway, I will end there. I will end in verse 12. Steve is going to be teaching the class next week. My family are going to be gone to East Tennessee, or I'm going to say Northeast Tennessee because I really don't know where we're going. We're going that direction on the map. But anyway, he is going to continue with this, begin chapter 8, and he can get into chapter 9 as far as he would like. We'll continue Nehemiah, though, next week. But again, I want to thank you for your comments as well. And just, again, you know, so many people, when they think of Nehemiah, it is, you know, he went to build the wall. Yeah, he went to build the wall. That's in chapter 6. But we still got half the letter left. And so that's really what the next few weeks are going to be, is looking at how the children of Israel kind of reestablished themselves. And again, the reason why I feel like that's so important to kind of know and study and understand, because this is the beginning of what we will see when Jesus comes. Because this is the beginning stages of those 400 years before Jesus comes to us. So thank y'all again for y'all's comments. There's the bell. We'll come back together and worship here in just a few moments. Thank you all.
When you talk about taking July 4th, we probably ought to read the Declaration of Independence every July 4th. Because that's what that's all about.
It is an interesting read, I got to say.
Where we were and where we are now.
Yeah.
But people don't think about those kinds of things. They think about Budweiser and bratwurst.
Yeah, and fireworks.
Yeah. And blowing fingers off.
Yeah, try.
How you doing, Alan?
Good. Sorry I had to go out again. I'm
well. How are you?
I was filling out the pre-K kindergarten one.
my friends take good care of you?
Hey, stop. That one was for the men's class.
Yeah.
Let me get up.
It's been down.
No, wait, don't
so
touch
we
it.
hope it gets back up soon. Well, good. Okay, well, hang in there.
Could you go give this to my dad?
Well,
He's right there in the
dead.
It's good. Alright, go give it to my dad.
Hello.